Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come on in. We're going to give just like an extra minute here for folks to come into the meeting, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Everyone's flooding in. You can't see it, but I can. So I'll just give folks not a few more minutes. That's way too much. A few more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so welcome to our webinar on NetSuite and Toolio. We're better together, and we're excited to talk to all of you about why and best practices for NetSuite and all of the fun stuff. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So hi. First of all, I'm Andrea Lechner-Becker. I lead marketing here at Toolio, and I'm going to be moderating today's lovely guests and keeping them on track and answering and getting all of your questions to the actual experts. So I'll keep it short and sweet here. So first is jot any questions that you might have into the Q&A or into the webinar chat. I'm sure at this point we're all super familiar with Zoom and how it operates. So just pop it into whatever feels most comfortable for you, and I will make sure that I either answer it directly in the chat or get it to one of the experts here to answer real time. So don't be shy. Second, in terms of what our content is going to look like today, we have about 40 minutes of content, so kind of a lot, followed by Q&A. So don't wait until the end to ask your questions, just pop it in, and then I know what everyone's going to be talking about, so I can kind of make sure that we get the questions asked at the right time with the right context. The goal here fundamentally is to share what we see retailers doing and to share best practices with everyone else who's maybe learning and growing along the way. And ultimately to really provide some actionable takeaways that you can take back to your team. If you manage NetSuite, cool. If you don't manage NetSuite and someone else does, this will give you a lot of good things that you can go have conversations about and facilitate a deeper conversation so you can get more out of the tool. But like I said, I'm going to keep my aspect short because I'm really just the conduit to the people who actually know the stuff. So first is Jay. So Jay works on the Toolio team. He's a product manager, which really means that like I'm your conduit here today, he is the conduit between our customers and what they're really trying to accomplish and the product and what it does for them. And part of what he has done here at Toolio is help build the integration between Toolio and NetSuite. So he knows a ton about NetSuite and even more about Toolio. So we're excited to have him on to talk about all of the great really functions that our joint customers get to use. Hi, Jay. Welcome.
Hey everyone, good to see. I think I've met most of you, but yeah, as Andrea mentioned, I'm a product manager here. I lead most of our data and integration efforts. So yeah, we've really worked hard on a lot of the NetSuite integrations, both from like delivering data more seamlessly into Toolio, but also starting to automate some of those functions to make sure that you can create items, create purchase orders, and transfer orders, the outputs of Toolio, directly in an easy fashion directly into NetSuite. So yeah, excited to cover the high levels of how we approach that, what setup looks like, and a quick demo of it today.
Yeah. And then we have Lee. So Lee is from RSM. RSM is a leading NetSuite consultancy. They do implementations, they do optimizations, they do best practices. And Lee comes to us with many years of experience helping retailers, not just at RSM, but before that at Deloitte. And so she is been around the block and she is seeing a ton of usage of the platform. And therefore she's coming with a lot of best practices about what the most successful retailers are doing to fundamentally really leverage all of this important data that NetSuite has at our disposal and translate it into planning best practices. So hi, Lee, welcome.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here to talk a little bit more about NetSuite and data, which is my child passion. So thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. All right, cool. So we're actually going to start with sort of the more broad NetSuite stuff that Lee's going to talk about. And so here's the agenda. So first of all, I'll set the stage a little bit. As I've kind of mentioned, about 70%, well, I didn't say this yet, but 70% of Toolio's customers are on NetSuite. And that means that we really leverage a lot of the NetSuite data in order to bring a lot of value to our customers. And one of the things that we experience a lot is that people want to improve their NetSuite data. So whether that's hierarchy or whether it's the way that they bring gift cards into the system, whether it's the way that they manage bundles, there's a lot of questions that our customers have that really originate in NetSuite. And so we thought we would bring an expert in NetSuite because we use the data and we try our best, but ultimately Lee sees a ton more clients than we do. And so we really wanted to help our customers better understand optimizations they can do in NetSuite that have the downstream impact in Toolio. So that's where we're going to start is NetSuite best practices. Specifically, we're going to talk about product hierarchy setup and some best practices there, and then ultimately transaction and sales best practices. So that's Lee's portion. And then we're going to go into how Toolio and NetSuite integrate. That's Jay's portion. So without further ado, Lee, tell us all of the things that we should be doing in order to improve our hierarchy.
Thank you so much. So so just a little bit of background. So product hierarchy is basically a tool. I consider it a tool to let you effectively and efficiently categorize and manage your product lines and your item across the entire enterprise. So a well-built product hierarchy can really help companies streamline their planning, purchasing, and also inventory management process. So there's a few things that we normally advise clients when they build out their product hierarchy. So the first thing is to use a top-down approach. Start with your most general category, and then slowly breaking it down to your subcategory, your product, and then introduce your attribute. And really, the best way to create your category is to understand your product offering. So just an example that I like to point out is, say, a client who deal in merchandising depend on whether or not they more focus on fashion, or they might be a sport gear distributor. They might have this similar product like shirt, shoes, or something like that, but their core product offering might be a little bit different. So the way they build their category will also be a little bit different, even though some of the product within their database might be similar at face value. And you also want to keep your hierarchy simple, avoid categorization. We normally don't advise clients to build a hierarchy that are more than 6 levels. That can create a lot of noise when you go into creating your reporting, or if you are using hierarchy on client-facing platform, it can create a lot of frustration. No one wants to click on 15 different links to find the product that they want to look for. So keep it simple, and your product, depend on how you use your hierarchy, should only show up in one category. If this is an internal hierarchy you're looking at, if you have product in more than one category, you might see some duplication when you have that cross categorization. However, if it is an external facing, having one product in different category might not be an issue. That might actually improve your exposure of this product, depend on where the customer is looking within your hierarchy.
Hey,
And
Lee,
also, yeah,
I have a question there. So when you think about hierarchy, I have heard that there's like a little bit of a disagreement sometimes because like marketing, and this comes from the marketer, right? Like we have the way that we want to position something on the website. So is the categorization as it exists on the website, should that reflect in the hierarchy or not necessarily?
that's a good question. So we normally do have clients who in the retails, they do have different versions of the hierarchy. So they have one version within the ERP that they use to facilitate different operation and transactional well, and then transaction within the ERP system. And then they do have a different hierarchy that they expose externally that have more of a marketing input in how the customer will see the product positioning.
Got it. So not necessarily, but maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then
Keep going.
go ahead. Yep. And then definitely understand the different level of the hierarchy. So when clients build out their product hierarchy, we often see they confuse category versus attribute. So the way I like to look at it is your category is like a container for you to put all of your product into. And then the attribute, when introduced to that, is what let you describe the product and let you pick out the product from, pick out the item that you are looking for from a majority of the product that you're looking at. And the attribute can directly describe the quality or the size of the product itself. So for example, a category might be, you can see in some retailer website might be women, shirt, skirt, and then when you go on and you click on the actual product, where you see the sizes and the color of the product, that is where attributes play into the hierarchy. And also be very intentional about the hierarchy levels, especially when it comes to the naming. Make sure it's simple and intuitive. And this, like I said earlier, this will drive how product can be navigated internally and externally. And this also allows scalability in the future. So, like I said, be very intentional about how you use the name and how you group different hierarchy, because down the road, when a new product introduced, you don't want to create a whole different branch of the hierarchy itself. Whereas if a well-built hierarchy, you can leave space so that you can find space to add that new product offer within your product hierarchy, existing product hierarchy.
And do you have like a rule of thumb for that kind of like leaving space? Like, do you put an item, say like experimental is like at some level so that you can like add whatever you want under it? Or how do you like more tactically do that? Leave space.
That's a very good question. So I will skip a little bit to the last point there where we say allow seasonal products. So not only when we see a new item being introduced in the hierarchy is when like the holiday season roll around and we have new seasonal product being introduced. In NetSuite, we actually have a tool for merchandise hierarchy, which allows user to maintain different versions of the product hierarchy. So on a day-to-day basis, we have a version with the core product that the client might use, but during seasonal time, the client can utilize that second version where they also maintain those seasonal products, so that on your day-to-day operation, you don't see that product you are currently not selling showing up in your reporting, in your product offering. But when that season, like holiday season, come around, that new version will allow you that visibility in that either new product or seasonal product.
Got it. Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And then the last is, because we skip around a little, is when you build out your hierarchy, visualize it, fill it out, set it up in the system, test it a lot, because it might take some time to test out a hierarchy at the beginning, but it will save you a lot of time in the future rather than you go live with this hierarchy that you built, you never test out, and you realize that it's not working how you intended to. At that point, it's a lot harder to change up your hierarchy and recategorize your item. But so yeah.
Okay, one more question on the tactical, like how do you test a hierarchy? What kinds of things do you do?
Yep. So my favorite way to test a hierarchy is first is to, like I said, set up in the system, and not only depend on how you want to use a hierarchy. Some clients that I've worked with normally use these hierarchies for their reporting. So test it out by creating a report and see how these hierarchy impact the way your report impact the way you are creating your report, and how the hierarchy help you represent the number or the statistic that you are looking at in your reports. And in a external facing context, set up these hierarchy, and maybe when you are testing through your website, navigate within the website just as if you are one of the consumer, to see whether or not the way the hierarchy is leading you to the product is how you want your external customer to see. So that, I would say, the best way to do that.
Got it. And who should all be involved in like the testing out of the hierarchy, or even like the building of a hierarchy in the initial phase? Like what departments, what roles, who do you typically see being involved in making these decisions?
Yeah, so definitely if you do have like a product development team, they would be the first point of contact in creating this product hierarchy. And you definitely want also to introduce team from the operational side and also marketing side to get their input, because the product hierarchy will be most often used by these two teams on the operational side for their internal reporting, and on the marketing side, see how these products should be marketed out and present to your consumer.
Right. Okay. Got it. And did you mention finance? Because I feel like finance normally has a really big voice in the way that reporting all works and operates, especially out of NetSuite.
Yes, that's a very good point. I definitely forgot to mention finance, because yes, they would be they are one of the key user of the product hierarchy internally. And the product hierarchy will help them kind of evaluate how your product is performing, and whether or not the way that the product hierarchy is being built is supporting the different goals that you might have for the organization.
Right. Okay, cool. Moving on, transaction best practices. Talk to us.
Yes, transaction best practices. So whether you are dealing with procurement, sales, or other internal process like receiving, item fulfillment, best practices is to develop a very standardized process. So you want to create a framework with different steps of that transaction, and make sure that you establish a very strict guideline on how to create those transactional documents. So mandatory data, supporting documents, who should go into the transaction and where should they act on the transaction. You want to be very clear on who are all the actors and what are all the different information that play into your process. And make sure you also factor in your data. Your data is going to help drive a lot of your transaction. So don't be afraid. Like, make sure you leverage your data. Like I said, the information stored in your master data can help drive a lot of the operation, which I will speak on later in my next point. So the next one is to streamline your approval flow. So a lot of our clients, when they have the transaction, they do require that they go through a certain approval flow. So make sure that you outline clearly the role and responsibility of the different actors within your organization play into this approval flow. And the one thing I do see clients often miss is to have a backup. When you don't have that backup, if someone say is out of office, you will have these transactions kind of sitting there in the queue, no one is touching it. Or if you have a turnover at your company and these transactions are sitting with an employee that is no longer there, you want to make sure you have an escalation point and also a backup user that can help you continue facilitate the approval flow of your transaction. And the next point is to introduce automation. So this is where master data play a lot into automation. We often see master data being used to leverage automation in approval routing. Your employee record is the best place to kind of manage that hierarchy in the approval flow and your like escalation point and your backup approver. You can also leverage automation for document matching. So like your freeway match, that can be automated, or sometimes even the approval routing itself, you can use automation so that document that match a certain criteria that your organization set out doesn't have to sit through the approval flow, and it can automatically flow through. You can also use leverage automation for your notification and communication. So instead of having an employee at your company sending out these different invoice or sending out email to your different partner, you can leverage NetSuite automation to have that sent out automatically and doesn't have that lag time between when your transaction being created and your receiver receiving that information.
So a question here around kind of fail reporting, right? So like, I feel like transaction data is one of those things where it's like 95% of the time it's awesome, but the 5% of the time that it's all messed up is what destroys all of the reporting and makes decision-making really challenging. What do your clients set up to find or isolate that concept, right? Like, oh, this gift card transaction came through erroneously, or like customer success gave someone a free product and the way that receipt came in was all weird. Like, how do you kind of manage things that didn't go to plan, either from an automation standpoint, a data perspective in general, or even like a process and human being perspective?
Yep, definitely. So so that's where most of our clients use automation a lot, is for those error detection that you were mentioning. So there's different way in NetSuite for you to set up, say a safe search, that if you see something not matching the criteria, you can leverage workflow and safe search in NetSuite to stop that transaction from going through and notify the appropriate actor to go in and review that transaction before they can be pushed to the next step within your process.
Got it. All right. One last question for you. And that doesn't mean that you can't ask more questions if you have them, audience members of Lee, but one last question before we go over to Jay. And that is around how often the hierarchy should be edited, adjusted. How often is too often? And or like, when should you be revisiting it? How often?
Yeah. So ideally, your product hierarchy should not change very often. The only time that you might want to revisit this hierarchy is if there is a change in your product offering. When you build out your hierarchy, initially you really want, like I said earlier, is you leave room for that new product so that you don't have to change up your product hierarchy every time a new element is introduced.
So like an example of a product change would be like an apparel retailer who's going to start selling like kids clothes, or like a traditionally men's retailer, like a Mack Weldon, who's now going to venture into women's clothing. This is like big enough, good enough to change the hierarchy. Yeah.
Yes. That's
Okay.
where you will see often new category being introduced, but we don't see a lot of mixing up of the entire hierarchy level.
Got it. All right, cool. Thank you very much. Again, if you have more questions for Lee, feel free. And then I ruined her great segue, because one of the things that Toolio uses a lot of is the save search. And I was like, oh, what a great segue. But there was the one little hierarchy conversation there that I just had to ask. So Jay, over to you. Let me get my cursor over here so I can get you onto your correct slide. Here you go, bud.
Thanks, everybody. So just jumping in here around how Toolio and NetSuite actually work together. Well, actually, before I get into that, I just want to give everyone a quick overview of the topics that I'll cover. So first, I'll give you an overview of like the Toolio and NetSuite workflows. And then I'll actually like just glance over the SuiteApp components. So Andrea, I'll take over from there. Just to like quickly walk through our safe searches, what's going on with the suite script that is actually included, and how our overall integrations work. Again, feel free to ask questions as I'm going through that. And then I'll actually touch on just the NetSuite setup in Toolio. So setting up from Toolio into NetSuite is relatively straightforward, but the more involved element is actually going to be configuring Toolio so that we are able to push your items and your purchase orders and transfers back into NetSuite. And from there, I'll do a quick demo of just like what PO creation from Toolio into NetSuite looks like, how you can troubleshoot a few things, how you can track the actual status of anything you're pushing from Toolio into NetSuite. And I'll actually give you guys a sneak peek as well around just some of the improvements that are to come on this side. And if there's any remaining questions at the end, we'll take those on. So coming back to this slide, as Andrew already mentioned, like over 60% of our customer base is using NetSuite as their ERP of choice. And the way that we really think about Toolio and NetSuite, or any ERP for that matter, in conjunction, is really by isolating the workflows so that Toolio is responsible for all of your planning, and then the ERP is responsible for your actual data, storing that, maintaining that, as well as executing from the outputs of your plan, right? So whether that's through merchandise planning, open to buy management, assortment planning, through demand forecasting and replenishment workflows in Toolio, all of those planning workflows are dependent on getting accurate historical and like real-time, sales, inventory, purchase order, transfer order information fed into the system. And simultaneously, in terms of your ERP, you need to be providing purchase orders, you need to be providing the items that you need to be creating. And that's where there's a really symbiotic relationship between Toolio and NetSuite in this case, where we're constantly getting the actual data fed in from the ERP. And then Toolio, again, is able to kind of output the fruit of your planning workflows directly into the system. And this is best demonstrated by the more detailed workflow here. So just looking at things from a high level, again, everything really starts from first feeding in data from NetSuite, right? And this is where I'll quickly glance over our safe search workflow in just a sec, but this is where we're really reliant on our safe search deliveries from NetSuite into Toolio. And the main benefit of why we use the safe searches is actually because we want to give you, the end user, full functionality and full customization over the safe searches. So you can add any filters on the fly, you can add any new fields on the fly, and exactly how you see it in that safe search from the NetSuite UI is how Toolio is going to actually receive that data. And this data, of course, is going to be used for not only merchandise planning, right? We're also leveraging all of your actuals for item plan and allocations, of course, but first and foremost, we're trying to establish your top-down financial forecast and merch plan. And that's where we're really going to be leveraging your historical inventory, sales, purchase order, receipts, and of course, product metadata. And you can think of the starting point of all of your workflows in Toolio, in merch plan rather, being like seeding. So seeding brings in that historical context, the historical seasonality curves, all that good stuff that helps automate and streamline your planning workflows. And that's all, of course, contingent on having accurate and reliable historical as well as live data. Once we have your top-down financial plan sorted in Toolio, we're going to move over to assortment planning. And this is really Toolio's like line planning module. This is where we're thinking about everything from a bit of a higher level, so your season as well as choice level. And this is where you can really conceptualize and plan your assortment, right? And you're thinking about focusing on new products that you might introduce, as well as what POs or what initial buys you may want to place. So that's where we see our first path of integration back into NetSuite. This is where you're able to create matrix inventory items, so both the parent as well as the children. And you're also able to create your initial set of POs. And one thing I do want to highlight there is that the purchase orders that we're creating from assortment plan, these are again meant to be high level, or more of a top-down season total plan. And as a result, the purchase order that we're trying to create here is more of an initial in-season buy. We're saving our replenishment workflows for item plan in this case. And that's where I'll jump to next. So item plan is where we're focusing on your core and existing product base. This is where we're going to really get more granular. This is where, for most of you, I think you've seen how Toolio handles item level demand planning, right? So we want to understand your demand forecast first and foremost, and then we'll generate a receipt plan according to all of your parameters and logistics around your lead times, your MOQs, all that good stuff. And ultimately, the output of that process is going to be recommended purchase orders, right? And this is going to be, again, granular down to the week level. It's really going to support your replenishment workflows for all of your core and existing products. And it's something that you should be running regularly in Toolio. And on the other side of that is like your allocation workflows. So for those of you who are using allocation in Toolio, you're familiar with kind of how we're understanding the transfer orders and the transfer receipts tied to those as well. So now we're trying to solve the problem of not only getting the right amount of units and products into your warehouses, but now allocating them to the right stores in order to fulfill your sales plans. And thank you, Andrea. So I'll start by sharing my screen now. So what I'll do first is just quickly walk through the Toolio SuiteApp, and I'll dive into the two paths, right? One is how do we actually get data from NetSuite? And the second, potentially more interesting question is how do we send data back into NetSuite? For most of you, I think you already have our SuiteApp installed. You can simply navigate to like the SuiteApp section, search for Toolio, and you'll find it listed right there. In terms of the components here, just to give a quick overview, all our SuiteApp is really doing is setting up two key components, I'll say. One is, well, let's say three. So the first and foremost is your safe searches. These are always going to be created as templates from Toolio, and I'll show you an example shortly. These templates are just meant to be a starting point. So essentially the most common configurations, the most common attributes that we see, but in each case, we're really relying on you, since you know your data best, to add any custom attributes, add anything you need, configure groupings, formulas, fine tune the criteria, all that good stuff in NetSuite. And part of the reason why, again, we're leveraging the safe search workflow is because that experience should be familiar to you, and it shouldn't be something that you'll have to manage, net new for the first time just for Toolio. And you can see here, we're splitting it into your product templates. So that's where we're getting all of your parent and child level product metadata. We're getting all of your inventory reporting, and then also your transaction feeds. So here we just have sales, purchase orders, and receipts, but actually we're going to be pushing an update shortly next week that is also going to start encompassing transfer orders and transfer receipts as well. Okay, the second key component here is basically just our Suite script itself, which is how we deliver the data to Toolio. For those who are interested, there's a few reasons why, in the past we've tried going through SOAP, the APIs, SOAP and REST, and each have their strengths, but each also have their weaknesses. And, I think this is actually the reason why we moved to this workflow, again, is to enable the user to have full control over the data that's being delivered to Toolio. Give them the ability to make changes in real time, and also for reliability. So this process, the script basically sends a snapshot of your safe search directly to our Azure storage containers, and then that gets ingested into Toolio, where you see it in your settings imports page. The final piece here is just going to be around the custom roles and integrations. So these two are already coupled here. So these are going to come out of the box again, and they're going to be utilized when we're setting up the integration so that we can send requests back to NetSuite and create those inventory items, create those transfer orders, purchase orders for you. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at a template here. So here's a transaction template where, in this case, again, I'm in a demo account, so it's very limited data being returned, but ultimately this sales template is, again, just meant to be a starting point for you. And in all of your accounts, you'll find that this save search is actually going to be locked, so you won't be able to save changes directly to it. Instead, we're going to ask you to add a unique title, and it will create a separate custom, like a separate like internal ID for the save search. That internal ID is ultimately going to tell our Suite script which save search to deploy. So we have all the steps documented around how to configure that and how to manage that on your side, of course. But it's as simple as just going to your script deployments. And sorry, yeah, before I jump to that, of course, the goal here is to just use what we have as a starting point, right? We have all of our core Toolio fields out of the box, but let's say you need to add something custom, or maybe you don't actually want to source one of these fields the way that we have it defined. You're always able to just go ahead and make that change. You can use, you can leverage like NetSuite formulas, of course, and you can also try to recreate this from maybe an existing save search that you might already have, which will hopefully help lessen the load to get your data into Toolio. And once you're happy with your save searches, you can go ahead and deploy them. So what this looks like is, just go ahead and press edit. It'll just be something as simple as this, where you're able to schedule a deployment. You can say, hey, run this every day, starting from this date at this time. This is going to be a local time from whatever your organization time zone in NetSuite is. And the only parameters that you're really going to need to focus on are the save search ID. So in this case, I think it was like, for example, if that's a save search ID that I've created, then that's the one that I want to use. I'll just go ahead and copy that into here, press save. And from that point forward, NetSuite is going to take the snapshot of my save search and deliver it to Toolio starting every day on a schedule from this time. If you need to ever trigger a one-off refresh, what you can do is you can either just set this to testing and then press save and execute. That will cause it to run immediately. The one thing to note is that you'll want to change it back to scheduled after you do this so that it continues running on the schedule. Alternatively, you always have the option to just say, I just want to download my save search, right? You can always just download the results and go ahead and import them as a CSV manually into Toolio as a one-off. And so the process for integrating or like acquiring the data from NetSuite is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. As you see here, of course, like things can get a bit more complex if you need to do formulas or mappings, but overall, what you see is kind of what you get with the save searches on the side. On the flip side, for actually delivering data back into NetSuite, that's where there is a bit of configuration required within Toolio. So you should be seeing my Toolio demo account here.
We are.
Yep.
Although it's blank right this moment, but we were.
While loading, I do want to add that is definitely very important here that we see that customer can choose what they kind of can see in data they can see in Toolio, because oftentimes we see that different system that we might integrate with doesn't have this kind of flexibility. So I would like to point out that is a very important thing that we see here with Toolio.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. That's definitely a big emphasis for why we took the approach that we did. Yeah, it really, again, empowers the user to make any changes they need to on the fly. And you can see those changes more or less in real time. You can just trigger a new save search and be deployed right away. So, okay, let me just come here first. So there is, again, some setup required in order for Toolio to pass data back to NetSuite. The main thing here is that, like, if you've spent any time in NetSuite, you probably realize that there's always internal IDs tied to everything. So tied to fields, tied to items, tied to locations, you name it, there's an internal ID. And ultimately, NetSuite expects that when you're pushing data from like an external system, it's going to be expecting that that system is communicating with NetSuite using those internal IDs. And that's where the bulk of the setup is going to lie. It's really going ahead and configuring any of your Toolio options. So let's say that I'm creating new items, for example, and I need to add, I want to pass over class as a value, or maybe color is a simpler example. Well, if I just send over these display names, NetSuite's not going to understand what that means per se. What I will need to do is say, show me my color list in NetSuite for all of my matrix options. And then I will need to just assign the export mapper value here so that this is the internal ID of what you're looking at in NetSuite. And this is relatively straightforward to do. Just go back here. You can just look for, like in this case, if I'm looking for my color, I can see my color list here, and I can see the internal IDs tied to them. So long as like these display names match Toolio, which hopefully we've done a good job with during your configuration process, that they are. So long as these are consistent, then you can simply just go ahead and download this as a CSV and just import this page, essentially this color list, into your Toolio options, and that will synchronize your internal IDs, your NetSuite internal IDs, with those options in Toolio. So when it comes to item creation, it's like relative, that's where the bulk of this is going to, of course, occur, right? We have a lot of, it really depends on how many attributes or how much data you want to be passing over from Toolio to NetSuite. But for each field that we are passing over, we do need to go through this configuration process. And again, our team is always happy to help, but it should be a relatively straightforward upload for the fields that you're looking for. So outside of that, we have a concept of exporters. And as I already mentioned, as we've already alluded to, the 3 resources that Toolio can export right now into NetSuite are going to be your items, so matrix items out from assortment plan, as well as purchase orders, which can either come from assortment plan or item plan. And then finally, we have transfer orders, which would be coming from your allocations module. And in each case, like the way that you would go about adding an exporter, well, first off, you'll have a default exporter defined. If you've talked with your customer success team about like your Toolio to NetSuite workflows, you will have a default exporter already in place for the workflow that you're looking to accomplish. Let's look at purchase order generation here as an example. And if you were to try to create a new exporter, you would be met with the same menu. So all this is doing is saying, hey, what is the integration that you are going to be sending the data back to? In this case, this is just leveraging the rule and the integration that I alluded to earlier, which is coming directly from our SuiteApp. And then this is asking, hey, what resource would you like to send? Is it purchase order, inventory item, or is it transfer order? And then which module do you want to be sourcing this data from? Item plan, assortment plan, or allocation? And then finally, down here is where we're going to get into the fun stuff, which is all of the sample data for the fields that you can reference coming out of item plan, right? And this is going to basically show you what are the fields you can actually select from, as well as give you a preview of what that data looks like in Toolio. Here is where you will, again, have a default field list where you're able to assign mappings and basically tell NetSuite, hey, this is the item name number I'm sending to NetSuite. This is the field that I want to use from Toolio. This is the location that I'm sending to NetSuite. This is the field I want to use from Toolio. And if there are any additional fields that you want to add, you can go ahead and add them as custom fields as well, and then define them as such. And the way to really think about it, again, is that you can review your sample data in real time here. You can see what the sample data is outputting some examples rather, and you can choose, okay, this is the actual field that I want to be sourcing to send over. I can add a new field. I can add a new field to send to NetSuite, define how I want to source that field. And then I can say, show me an output preview so that I don't have to do any testing. So I don't have to go I don't have to go back and forth manually myself. And this way you can see, based off of my configuration here, I'm going to be sending the data to NetSuite this way.
So remember that Jay is a data guy. So when he says this is the fun part, I don't necessarily know that everyone thinks it's the fun part, Jay. But what I do think is the fun part is all of the time that this saves people when they do things like transfer orders or PO creation, because it's like so painful and monotonous, and like the lowest man on the totem pole or the highest man on the totem. I don't exactly know that that saying is correct, but anyways, whoever, or politically correct, I'm sorry if that offended anyone, but like, listen, the person, somebody has to do that and it's painful. So let's show how easy it is with Toolio. And plus we're running out of time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, too many questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I don't think that sarcasm is beneath me. Like, I understand this can be painful as well, but it's a one-time kind of setup process. Again, unless you're making any structural changes or you need to add new fields, this isn't something you need to be managing, more than hopefully during the initial like configuration process. And again, there's a lot of tooling here in place to try to make that process a bit easier on your side, and of course, like our team is here to help as well. So as we are running out of time, let me just quickly show you what this would look like. So I'm just going to be, again, I'm in item plan here. The exporter configuration that we're just looking at is defined here. Let's say I'm happy with how things look. I can go ahead and select one item or a few items. I can filter for the ones I want. I can filter out the ones I don't want. And I can also configure the time frame. The time frame here is actually quite important because it's going to be indicative of the how far out we send purchase orders over to NetSuite. Ultimately, what Toolio is going to do is, regardless of which items you pick, which date range you pick, we're going to go ahead and group them together based off of your vendor, and the based off of the vendor, based off of the due date, and based off of the items, right? Or based off of the destination. Sorry. So we're going to group them together so that you're not like creating one separate PO for every SKU per se, and everything is going to tie like neatly together. Again, if I press export here, there's a few ways I can actually track the progress. One will let you know that this has been added to the queue. You can always go to your settings page, go into exporters. So you can either go into exporters and like say, show me the history, or you can just go directly into export history and you'll see, hey, I just queued this, it's now running. You can either, this shouldn't take more than say 1 minute to complete. So I can either go ahead and just refresh my page here. And if there are any errors or messages, we're going to tell you exactly what NetSuite is saying the issue is in this column here. And we have an FAQ section to help you diagnose that yourself. But in this case, cool, everything is looking good. How do I see that in my NetSuite instance? Well, you can, the easiest way is probably just simply go into, in this case, I created a purchase order. So I'm just going to go into my purchase order list. And in this view, I already have, let's say I already have the date, the create date tied here. And so these are the POs that I just went ahead and pushed. Okay, the other way to just like track things a bit more granularly, if you are curious into the actual requests that like Toolio was sending, you're curious into the integration activities, what you can do is go ahead and go into setup, integration, manage integrations. You'll find Toolio here. And then you'll be able to see an execution log of everything that Toolio has sent over. You'll be able to view like the requests, so what we've shared over, and then the response. So if there's any messages that NetSuite's trying to communicate to you, regarding like errors or yeah, you would be able to download both of these as well. So the only other thing that I wanted to quickly touch on is just a few areas where we're actually going to be improving the functionality here. I know for a few of you guys who are already using this workflow, I think you'll be looking forward to these. But yeah, within like the quarter, we're really trying to help streamline some of the PO generation workflows actually, so that we have a recommended purchase order list, similar to how we have like recommended transfer orders. That way you're not pushing purchase orders separately from assortment plan and item plan, and instead you have like one single source of truth from Toolio that communicates directly to NetSuite. We're also going to be automating the tying of Toolio user to the NetSuite employee, so that when you're sending the request from Toolio to NetSuite, we can just tell who triggered that request to be sent, and then associate it as such to the NetSuite employee. And then the other two quick things are we're going to be allowing you to schedule those exports. So the primary workflow here is going to be like transfer orders. Let's say that you want that to be sending out every day on a schedule. You can have that automatically send over your transfer orders every morning in conjunction with how your allocation strategies are being run. And then finally, we'll help make the processes here a bit more seamless, so that if I'm like creating a purchase order from item plan or wherever you may have it, we will just link you directly into the job when it's complete. And then we'll actually be able to generate the NetSuite URLs so that you can just click into those purchase orders and those items as well.
That's awesome. We do have one question around how wholesale impacts the PO creation. If you have your wholesale plan in Toolio, does that get incorporated too, is basically the question.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I would need to understand like the specifics of how your business is oriented there, Jake, but it ultimately has very little impact into how we're creating those POs. I mean, most of that is going to be dealing with your demand planning workflow, right? So we want to make sure that we're evaluating wholesale as its own channel, understanding the true demand there, and then generating the purchase orders required to fulfill that demand. Ultimately, once we get to like most of that channel specific work is going to be done during the demand, understanding the demand. And then, yeah, once we start generating the receipts required as a result of that, that is just going to be passed over to NetSuite the same way as any other purchase order. The only thing that we may want to tweak is which location it's going to, or if there's any like custom attributes that you want to add to tag those purchase orders as wholesale orders.
All right. So I know we've gone a little bit over by like about 10 minutes. So thanks for everyone who has stuck around. We do have a couple of resources. So Lee, we only had time and we didn't even have totally enough time for Lee to talk about transactions and product hierarchy, but there are a bunch of other things around inventory and receipts and a bunch of other stuff that we have this article on sort of NetSuite requirements, but really it's best practices for NetSuite in general in order for Toolio success or really any planning success. And also if you go to our help center, we've got a bunch of resources that Jay was mentioning on NetSuite that dig really deep into all of this if you do want to learn any more. And I think you might even see Jay again on some looms in there and all sorts of stuff. So plenty of resources. And then we're also, RSM is working on a really great resource that isn't quite ready yet. So we'll be sending that along in the follow-up messages after the webinar. And again, if you have any questions, of course, we pride ourselves on being available to our customers or future customers. So feel free to just email us at the email address you get the recap from, or anyone, anytime. We're always really available. And we really just want to help retailers get more done, improve their margin, reduce out of stocks, get in stock, get more sales and all of the good stuff. So our door is always open for any help that we can provide. But with that, thank you so much, Jay and Lee. I think this was super helpful. Hopefully people learned something, and thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Okay,
everybody.
bye.
Appreciate your time.